Thank you, everyone. This is my fourth visit to Chile. I feel very honored to be here again and also to see some of the principals who have actually worked with us on some of the practices. I want to pick up where my colleagues have just left off, where Professor Ellen Goldring talked about the leadership pipeline, and also my colleague, Professor Jason Grissom, talked about what principals do in effective schools. And so this is important because when we think about a reflection model, and there's the what that describes what we know, and there's the so what, meaning from these evidences, from all of the information that we have, and why are these things important to what we do? But eventually, is the now what? What do we do with this information? What does it mean to principals and leaders, teacher leaders in Chile? What does it mean for 8 o'clock Monday morning? So I want to say, even though the perspectives shared on the pipeline and also school leadership are perspectives from the US, but we shared the common objectives. OECD 2010, when they looked at high-performing systems, they identified the effective high-performing systems with 4 things: access, quality, equity, and efficiency. And the hardest part sometimes to understand is, how is equity measured? And it's the correlation between the backgrounds of the students and also the learning outcomes. And so all 4 things are important, and we share the same goals, and we also have the same target. And yesterday, when we were meeting with the provost, and he cited the previous president, said the difference between a dream and a project is a target. So let's look at the target. And the target here is on equity, even though we know access, quality, and efficiency are important. And I'm just showing one picture from many of the efforts that we've been trying to make in the US. And this one is for about 30 years. On a scale of 1 to 500, we have closed the gap between Black students and white students by 9 points. It's an improvement, but we have a persistent gap on equity. So in many ways, the work that we have really need to move forward. So the focus on equity is focusing on making change. And we have lots of really excellent research on things that are identifying important factors, causes, the scope, and what we know about leadership, teacher leadership, and also the relationship between what we do and the students' learning outcomes. But the challenge, so those are descriptive and correlational. The challenge for researchers, but also practitioners, for us on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, is a causal question. Is what do we do to reduce this gap? And I am showing a website link. This is to the W.T. Grant Foundation, but many of our foundations and where we receive our funding for work really emphasize on making change. And so this is the framework presented by Jason with the equity lens or the equity focus, especially thinking about, when you go through the pipeline, you come into the house, which is your school, and within your school, and the excellent questions asked by the audience. One was, what's a quick win? What should we do first? What are some of the things that we as leaders can actually put in place? As you can see, there's a lot of conversations about both the principals' skills and also their behaviors, focusing on something related to teachers. So let's think about this. what do we know about teaching and how teachers teach? I will cite a study that's the RAND Corporation, the think tank. This is in 2016. So it was before COVID, before AI. And they asked the teachers the question, where do you go to find your teaching materials? About 95% of the teachers, both for English language arts and also math, said they go to Google, they go to Pinterest, and they find their own materials. Does that sound familiar? So that's not bad, but it's very unpredictable. Imagine today, after COVID, in the age of AI, if we do this study again, what the variation will be. And some teachers will do excellent. Some teachers will really struggle. And if you ask the teachers in your own schools, think about what might be the answers. So when my colleague Jason Grissom talked about equity, and the question asked about what are some of the things we can do to address equity, I think the biggest factor is the access to quality instruction. The access to quality instruction is highly correlated. Think about earlier we talked about the correlation. Highly correlated both with the socioeconomic status of your students, the backgrounds of your students, and also with the students' learning outcomes. In research, when we think about causal models, we ask about the Z variables, the lurking variables. This is the most important variable there, is the access to good teaching. Because typically, even within the same school, you have teachers have different practices. So what does that mean in terms of what the leaders can do to address that? Teaching is a mystery, and it's being perceived by different people as different things. This is actually a picture one of my students who was a teacher before showed just about, and I see lots of smiles. But the research actually shows that the closer you get into the classroom, between a teacher and his or her students, the murkier it is. And because we all know there's good teaching, and it's like an art. And art is unique, complex, hard to explain. Some people are really good at it. It's maybe hard to learn. Or is it actually a science? If it's a science, you can articulate, you can describe, you can assess, you can replicate. And so for us as researchers or practitioners, we're always somewhere in between. And so the challenge is, what can we do about that? So after the 2009 PISA assessment, there was a big study commissioned by OECD with a group of researchers and really looked into some of the high-performing systems. And then asked the questions all the way from policy, school principals, teacher practices, and identified a set of factors. One of the things that they identified was really about professional development and in some of these systems. A few things that I learned just from describing, earlier we talked about descriptive and correlational, describing what they saw. One thing is what to learn. They see that professional learning should be job specific, subject matter specific, and embedded in the teacher's day-to-day. They also saw the importance of really learning from your peers. So a good example from a peer is better than probably 5 days, 10 days of sitting in a professional development session. The other thing they learned is the expertise, the leadership of peers should be recognized, made visible, and so there should be a system to actually give them both responsibilities and also, in many ways, authority or power to take the lead. So those are the three things just being observed from the study. So I go a little bit deeper. There is a routine. Routine means if you learn calligraphy, if you learn martial arts, if you do any of the things that at the beginning is intuition, but eventually becomes something of a habit. So there's the Japanese lesson study. What they do is intentionally identify things they would like to improve at both the school level and cross-school level. And so they have a cycle of learning and then eventually go through that and to be able to impact teachers' dispositions, attitudes, and eventually behaviors. I won't be able to get into each one too closely, but as you can see, just an impression, so there is a routine there. They also saw that in China, especially in Shanghai, where PISA results were collected, they saw teachers also have this teaching study group model. They do lesson planning together as a unit, and then they observe each other's teaching. They give feedback, and then they refine the lessons and for different ways to be able to see if the change they wanted to make are actually changing either the learning results or teachers' behaviors. And so these are different kinds of routines. They also saw the system. It's not enough just to do this within one school. So they saw the top-down support and bottom-up initiatives. And the system will actually happen within each school, but also as a system with a way to identify the needs of the schools or the teachers and to be able to be supported by the district or the state. In China is the province. In Japan is the prefectures. But also if they are initiatives or new curriculum reform, any of the top-down projects could also be worked through this structure. So all of those things eventually show an approach, and this approach is actually quite scientific. So now we're thinking about from art to science. Why is it scientific? There is this new all-the-rage term called improvement science. And you can see it's being talked about in the US by the foundations. But really, if you think about that approach is grounded in really thousands of years of practice by practitioners around the world, but it's really much better theorized so that we can actually learn. Science can be theorized and then can be replicated from one place to another. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the improvement science approach related to how to improve what we do within a school and across schools. So for this, again, now we see what we actually observed in Japan, in China, in Singapore. The first element is what we call a cycle. And this is PDSA, plan, do, study, and act. It's actually quite scientific as a trial, but you've got to close that cycle, that you will plan what you want to do to identify your target. And that comes from collecting information, using literature, using past evidences to know that where's your starting point. And then what you will do is actually implement. Once you implement the change, the idea, you will actually need to analyze what happens, set specific goals and analyze. So that was being practiced in Japan, in Singapore, in Shanghai. But the last part is act. ACT is actually an important loop a lot of times practitioners don't close, is to be able to do this again, to actually assess the change. Was it better? A lot of times when we do innovation, quote and unquote, it's something different. Being different doesn't make it better. And so when you try something different, you want to know, does it create results? So that's the first one. Just have a disciplined trial cycle. But it needs to not happen once. It needs to happen repeatedly. So if you are a school leader, if you're a teacher leader, you're trying something different, something new. You do the PDSA or the teaching study model in Shanghai or the lesson study in Japan. That needs to be actually over time, because if you just do a before and after, one time we know many other things are happening in your school. And so those are maybe the reasons contributing to the change. So repeating that gives it reliability and validity. And I have this picture of Bruce Lee. Hope you are familiar with him. He has this famous saying is that I am not afraid of the man who can do a kick 10,000 times. Can do 10,000 different kinds of kicks. Just like in schools, we try lots of different things. But I'm afraid of the guy who does the same kick 10,000 times. Because every time you're a little bit better than before and you know the difference, and eventually it becomes trained spontaneity, that it becomes natural. Like Steph Curry shooting 3 points. And when he actually does it, he says, I don't think about it, I just do it. Because teaching is such a complicated task. To be able to do it naturally comes with practice. And the practice comes from the repetition, but also knowing what you want to improve. So that's the second component. This is also very important, especially if we want our practice in one place, one school, to be helpful for others, or for others to be able to do this continuously, is to have this community. It's not just community that we have a good social network. It's a community that share common objectives and common targets, and also shared disciplined approach. So I have this picture of people doing PDSA continuously, but connected. This is where the Select Center here and lots of the places, what I have observed of the high-performing systems have. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. Why is that important? Why do we need to actually share what we learn from each context? Because I personally am very tired of hearing people say, there are things that are actually working other places, but different contexts are different. And then, but there are things we can actually, if it's a science, we can tease out what are some of the things that you should have in every context? What are some of the things that are customizable? And that's a responsibility, and that's a difference between practitioners' knowledge and professional knowledge or applied research knowledge. Because for us, in every context, when we do something which is an art, as I said before, it's great because it's specific, it's unique, it's addressing the needs of that one place. But when you only have that, it's like a spark. The spark would happen, it would disappear. And it cannot be shared from one place to another. But if you make that connection of practices from multiple places, what would happen is there are 3 non-negotiables. So those are the things within every context you should have when you implement this collaboration or improvement that you want to do. It could be for instruction, but it also could be for school management, for classroom management. And those are the things, the task itself doesn't matter. It's the routine, it's the system, it's the way of thinking that would matter. Why? What are the 3 non-negotiables? One is, as peers, you should see one another's work. The practice should be visible to your peers. Think about researchers. We have peer-reviewed results or publications. Teachers' work, principals' work should be visible to their peers. The other one is when you actually make a change, make an improvement, it actually should be saved, should be accumulative, accessible, and shareable. That way, it doesn't go away. The sparks will be actually eventually saved and turned into a fire. And then last, you should know if it's better than last time. That's one it's really hard to do. Unless you close that PDSI circle every time, you would not know if it's better than it used to be. So those are the 3 non-negotiables. Everything else is negotiable. You will have different kinds of schools, different kinds of teachers, and we will have a couple examples. So I have Confucius' picture here from about 500 BC. There's a lot to be learned from someone else. Anytime when you have 3 people, you can learn something. But there's also a lot of really disciplined reflection of compare and contrast that need to happen for us to really learn effectively. And so I'll push this further, and this is especially for the researchers in this room and faculty members, for us to think about our responsibility. And a lot in the US, it's being framed also as research practice partnership, is we need to learn from practice and take it a level up. So this what, so what, and now what is continuously being collected both in a way, we have theories that we contribute to theories with empirical evidence, but eventually we will inform practice. So that's a part of this cross-cultural learning. So I say that to set the stage for a couple of examples. They're not perfect, and we're still, in many ways, working on this. So I have one example is what we did, started in 2013, and I saw several of the principals here that learned from some of our work. So this was after the PISA results and after the the effective high-performing systems analysis. So we worked with the university in Shanghai and identified 6 school districts so that we can actually implement and what they are doing with teachers and within schools. But we worked with principals to make this happen. Earlier, we saw this researcher's role in the middle. So what we did was theorize what we observed and the art. We try to turn that into science. So we identify those 3 non-negotiables that I just talked about: public, shareable, and also validate for improvement. And we call that the TPEC model, teacher-peer excellence, so that we can explain to American school principals what the Shanghai model is all about. We also put that in the system. So we know that within any system, it's not just this one little engine that could actually, go through and make some of the changes. And as Professor Ellen Goldring and also Professor Jason Grissom talked about, there are lots of things happening in the school. So all of those things were in the system that we also put on the map for the school principals and teacher leaders to understand. And this model was started in 2013 with 6 districts, and each one had 3 schools piloting, and also being picked up by a state initiative for Tennessee leaders. So they were sharing some of that models. It's not a perfect networked improvement community, but it was starting to spread. The sparks were being spread out. During that process, we learned a few things about the principals. Because schools were different, we had some of the schools were high-performing, high socioeconomic status in terms of the students, and the teachers were actually with different levels of expertise. So in that case, the principal only had to be facilitators. They can take a step back. They can let the teachers take the lead because of the conditions in the school. Or we also had schools that are really struggling with classroom management, a lot of students with learning differences, and the teachers were having high turnover. So the principals working in those schools had to be directors. So they could take charge. They have to model those, not because they didn't know how to be facilitators, but because the conditions required them to actually set the agenda for the new TPEC teams and be there to model how to give positive feedback, good, strong, and combined with critical feedback. And so those are directors. So those are kind of the two different, on the two ends of the spectrum. We also have principals who are in between. So we call them the differentiators. They adjusted their roles depending on who they're working with. So those are some of the things we also learned from the TPEC model implementation. And eventually, this is where the researchers could come in. We want to know, does it work? Remember, we want validation. We want, even just with a implementation with a model like the TPEC model, moving it from Shanghai to public schools in Tennessee. This is, I would thank for the institute that's led by Professor Jason Grissom. We have this research practice partnership with Tennessee Department of Education. So we have longitudinal data on students learning, teachers teaching, and principals leadership. So we were able to actually measure and compare the teachers in these schools, and similar teachers in similar schools find a comparison group. I won't get into the details, and to be able to track over time for up to 3 years to see what are some of the outcomes of both how teachers are teaching once they use the TPEC model, and also the learning trajectory of the students' learning. So that was the Shanghai model. So I want to now, oops, how do I go back? No, I can't go back. Oh, here. Give me 1 second. So why I was presenting the TPEC work in 2018, a colleague from Chile in the Catholic University saw the presentation, and also this is why my first trip to Chile is to talk about the TPEC model. And so there was a early implementation from Shanghai to Tennessee to Chile by our colleagues. And I think Claudia was one of the team. Christian was one of the on the team as well. And it was very interesting because as soon as the model was to be implemented in 2020, something happened, COVID. And so in many ways, the challenge presented by COVID made it possible for teachers in the remote areas when they actually have trouble going to see one another's work because all it was online, was on Zoom. So they were able to actually observe each other, give feedback, and save the comments, and also the implement the new lesson plans. And they used the cycle. As you can see now, we're familiar with this. And these are some of the pictures shared by my colleagues as they were actually defining what are the objectives they want to do. That's their PDSA cycle, and to be able to improve instruction. So those are two examples. They are still, in many ways, there are lots of struggles that we went through, and to have it sustainable in any of the systems, those are some of the things that are really are challenging for all of us. My last example is very new, and I just came back from 3 weeks, again in Asia, learning from Shanghai, Hong Kong, and my colleagues in Taiwan. Because I mentioned earlier, AI. AI is happening, like it or not, and what are teachers doing, using it, not using it, how are they using it? So you can see that the places, and especially ahead is Singapore and Taiwan, they have master teachers selected to work with AI experts to really both to turn their materials into downloadable materials for the teachers, but also to customize the AI prompts for lesson planning. So that way, something that's very complicated for regular teachers has a really nice starting point, but then they can be actually contextualized in each school. So that's one thing, something that we are collaborating on and working together, and I will invite colleagues from Chile to work with us. Here's just a screenshot of what they are actually doing in one of the master teachers workshops for principals and teachers. And they're working on, for this one, is problem-based learning. Problem-based learning is familiar with vocational education, but also for a lot of the classrooms. And so they actually have so you can, I know it's in Chinese. So you see the PBL, where they actually have standards, the gold standards for PBL, international standards for both teachers and students. And then they have prompts for ninth grade, for example, for PBL related to science. But these are prompts written by master teachers and tested out repeatedly. So this is, again, the improvement science. So they know these have been validated. But every time when you rerun, then has a different lesson plan. So the teachers from different kinds of schools, some of them rural, some of them big, some of them small, can actually customize those. They can sit together and see which ones will work out. They can test it. So all the things that we talked about, those non-negotiables, public, shareable, and storable, and validation for improvement, were embedded in something like this. But it requires leadership, requires support. So I will end with this last slide, that think about the conditions we can create as school leaders. Part of that is the power of collaborative inquiry. The Chinese has this word called, for knowledge, has two characters. And it's learn, 学, meaning to learn. 问 means to ask. So for centuries, thousands of years, we say to learn and ask. But today, in a digital age, we should flip it. It's actually ask and learn. Because when you write prompts, when you do action research, it's the kind of question you ask. So ask and learn. And we can flip this and create knowledge that's actually transferable, not just from one principal to another, but across different cultural settings. Okay, thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias a la profesora Xiu Cravens por sus valiosas ideas y también por la inspiradora presentación. Vamos a dar paso ahora a las preguntas del público y vamos a ver quién ya ha hecho sus consultas a la profesora. Please.
La primera pregunta que tenemos es de Felipe, de la Universidad del Desarrollo, y dice: en los ciclos de colaboración, el liderazgo escolar juega un rol clave en promover una cultura colaborativa. ¿Podría profundizar en qué prácticas han demostrado ser más efectivas en que los docentes quieran participar y sostengan ese trabajo?
She wants you to say it again, yeah.
¿La repito entera? Ya. En los ciclos de colaboración, el liderazgo escolar juega un rol clave en promover una cultura colaborativa. ¿Podría profundizar en qué prácticas han demostrado ser más efectivas en que los docentes quieran participar y sostengan ese trabajo?
That's an excellent question. Yeah. So when we actually introduced the TPEC model to U.S. public schools, remember first, it requires observation of each other's work. That was lots of trepidation. Teachers say, we don't want to do this. And this is where the beauty of a routine happens. A lot of times when we talk about school climate earlier, we saw so hard to change the school climate. And when you introduce a new model from one culture or one setting to another, that's always the challenge. So in many ways, people have to make a decision. Do you go ahead and adopt the routine and hope that the routine will gradually change the culture or change the climate? In this case, it was yes. So if you remember Karate Kid, which is the movie, the old one and the new one, and Mr. Miyagi asked the Karate Kid to wipe the windows. It was a routine. And it was not to change his beliefs, his values, but by doing this repeatedly and learning from it. And it really changed eventually how he reacted and how he actually performed. And so this is what happened. We asked the teachers just to try it. Just try to observe each other's work and see what happens. And it opened their eyes. And many of the teachers who have done this for 5 years, 10 years, and said, I cannot believe how much it really helped me to see Mrs. Smith's work across the hall. And also changed, then the next thing we wanted to do, remember, was to be able to give feedback. When you actually see one another's work, when it's visible to you, your conversation becomes a lot more focused on instruction, not on the person. And it became something about the problem of practice instead of about the individuals, also about some of these kind of feelings. So it's becoming very evidence-based, objective. And so to answer the question is, we actually just asked them to do it, give it a try. And that actually became something the teachers say, you cannot take it away from me anymore because I have benefited from it. You've got to let people benefit from something so simple that it might be kind of deceptively simple, but it's worth a try.
Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más antes de seguir con el programa, y que es desde el sistema escolar. Acá Roberto Bravo de Trehuelas School, dice, rector de ese establecimiento, dice, una de las cosas que las escuelas siempre reclaman es la falta de tiempo. Entonces, ¿cuál es la sugerencia para implementar este modelo en las escuelas de Chile, pero me imagino también más a nivel global?
Great, yes. It is very true in many of the Asian systems that teachers teach 3 to 4 periods, but they have much larger classes. In the US, the teachers have to teach 6 or 7 periods. And I have a slide, but with time, we don't show this. But in many ways, when we worked with the schools, the successful schools were able to actually redo their master schedules. The teachers and principals actually are very good at identifying time throughout their day. Also, a lot of schools have already built in things called professional learning communities. There are also different activities. So one thing earlier question asked is, what would you not do? What would you recommend that they leave out? The Gates Foundation has this really good term. It's called strategic abandonment. You've got to discard when things don't work, when you have these improvement cycles and assessments. If they don't work, don't keep them. This reason that teachers and principals don't want any new things is because there's so many things always being given to them, added to them. And so when the schools that actually implemented or expanded the TPAC models, they redid their master schedules, identified 45 minutes at the beginning. I'm happy to share some of those time schedules. They were able to identify 40 minutes in the morning for teachers to work together, but focusing on instruction, focus on change and measuring change, not to make copies, not to talk about outings, not to talk about other things. And so those are some of the things that actually are necessary for us to be able to make it work, and especially related to time.